In our last video, we looked at basic fingerprinting techniques for powder, lifting developing impressions with granular or magnetic fingerprint powder, and then just generally how to lift the impressions off the surface. Today we're going to expand on that by marking these fingerprints up as they would be in actual crime scene investigations, to be able to differentiate which fingerprint was lifted or located at any particular location, and who lifted it, when it was lifted, and so forth. So it basically is a placement of where those fingerprints were located for to maintain that continuity of evidence. Before we do that, I just want to quickly go back to the basics for 1 second. So as we said last week, we did the general powdering techniques. If you're still having problems lifting fingerprints without getting wrinkles in the tape or being able to lift it properly, I just want you to try this basic function, is to just take the roll of fingerprint tape and apply it onto any surface, whether it be a flat surface, horizontal plane, or whether it be on a vertical surface, and just practice, even without dusting up fingerprints. Just apply the tape onto that surface and iron out any artifacts that show up, for instance air bubbles and whatnot, just to ensure that you're getting that technique properly. It's just going back to the very basics of how to apply that tape to lift it successfully without any artifacts. And if you can do that either on a horizontal or vertical plane, it will just take it back one step further back than lifting the developed impression. So carrying on for today, we're going to develop some impressions, and before we lift them, we are going to mark them up. Now, included in the markup, we need to identify which fingerprint it is that is of interest or what is being captured on that particular fingerprint lift. Now, as you're well aware, you can have multiple fingerprints appearing on a similar surface or on a surface, and they may be in close proximity to one another. So, as we've discussed, every fingerprint has to be photographed before it is lifted. So if you're photographing the fingerprint, you need to isolate which fingerprint it is that you have dusted up, which one is relating to the scale and the identifier that you're putting with that print, so that it can be more easily referenced down the road. And as well, when you do lift the print, that the information pertaining that print is synchronized with the photograph, and it's the same information that appears on the fingerprint card when it's lifted. So in order to do that, we have these wax markers, or these China markers, that will leave a waxy residue that will be left on the surface, and much like fingerprint secretions, the fingerprint powders will adhere to that and increase its visibility either through contrast or like color. And it will also show up well in a photograph for identifying the area of interest, and also lift off the surface along with the fingerprint residue when you're collecting the developed impression. So we'll start off with just by putting a few impressions down on the surface. So we're using obviously we're using a white colored tile. So in this particular case, we're going to dust it up using black magnetic fingerprint powder using our magnetic applicator. Again, making sure that you're not trying to drop the powders down on the surface. You're also not putting it down and grinding the tip of the mag wand across the surface. You want to use it like it's a fingerprint brush or bristles of a brush, and just lightly go over the surface, reclaiming any excess powder, any residue that's left behind. Cleans off and leaves a nice, clean, visible impression behind. So we have a cluster here of 4 digits. Just blow off any excess that's left. And while we're marking this up, again, as we've explained in lecture, any time that we are going to lift the fingerprint, it needs to be photographed first. So because whether it is a single digit or whether it is an apparent cluster, you can identify those with as one identifier itself. And what I mean by that, as we've referenced in the lecture, a single digit can just be assigned its own scale and its own reference number. If it's a cluster of fingerprints, as we've just developed here, that appears anatomically to be as one touch or one contact impression with multiple fingers, it can be assigned one scale and one reference number. If you have fingers that, by the location of where they are located, are likely not to have come from a single touch, then each one will have to be lifted individually with its own scale and its own reference number. So for the purpose of this here, to make it more visible, I'm going to use the China marker here. I'm going to use a white marker. Again, it's up to the developer as to which one they want to use. Generally, I would tend to use one the same color as the powder, but I'm going to reverse that this time to make it more easily recognizable with the residue and how it works with the powder. So the idea of the China marker is to circle the area of interest. So because these fingerprints are being lifted with one scale and one reference number, the entire cluster will be circled as one lift. So I'm just going to mark it off with the China marker. Very difficult to see on camera as it is right now, but the residue exists. Now I'm just going to take the mag wand and powder to show you how the powder will adhere to that residue, and now it makes it visible. So as long as you can see where the marker is applied and you know where to dust it up, either way, as long as it provides a contrast before it's photographed, is fine. So I've circled that area. You have to bear in mind when you're doing this to take into consideration the width of the tape. So because it is a cluster impression, I'm using a wider tape. In this case here, I may even opt for one that's even a little bit wider, just because of the width of the impressions, the height of them. It makes it easier to capture all of the detail that's on there. Now, with the advent of these particular self-adhesive scales, and we have them in our kits here with these packages, or with these containers, these 20 millimeter adhesive scales will have a tackiness on the underside, and you can apply that onto the surface next to where the impressions are. Any information, including the detailed impression itself, anything that is incorporated within the context of the China marker is considered to be of reference to that particular scale and reference number that's assigned to it. Sometimes the adhesive on these scales is such that it is too tacky and it won't come off the surface itself, because ideally when you apply it to the surface, photograph it, and then you go to lift it with the fingerprint tape before putting on a backing card, you want the scale to lift off as the fingerprint residue does and be adhered to the underside of the tape, so when you put it on the backing card, it is sandwiched between the backing card and the top surface of the fingerprint tape. Sometimes to avoid or to minimize the tackiness, if you just put it on your hand and allow the moisture of your hand to kind of absorb and take away some of the adhesive properties of the scale and then put it on, it will come off the surface easier when you go to lift it. Obviously not recommended if there's going to be any issue of swabbing for DNA evidence. You don't want to be including your own in there as well, but that's just a side issue. As I said, these scales are adhesive type, self-adhesive ones. With the advent of the scales, it provides the opportunity to write certain information on the scale rather than actually on the fingerprint lift or around the lift. So you can take a moment and write required information on the scale. You have to write small, obviously, because of the minimal amount of void area on the scale, but you can write the information in context to that particular lift before you put it on to where the fingerprint lift is. Much easier than putting the blank scale down and then trying to write it and potentially disturbing or disrupting the impression as it sits. So write the information out first and then put the scale on.